My formative working years started in 1952 at age 20 when I graduated from Toronto Central Technical School's art course. My entry point was at the CBC as an actor, along with the then young William Shatner and Roger Sutton, Tales of Adventure, both of us doing walk-ons. It soon followed by a more secure and better paying position as a TV graphic artist. But my real attraction became the control room, where I became mesmerized by the television plays that were produced there live and transmitted into people's living rooms. But soon enough, my fascination waned, and I loudly voiced my criticism at the frivolous, meaningless, pedestrian, inconsequential tales being ground out week after week, and was told in strong rebuke, "If you can do better, why don't you?" Talk about chutzpah. I had never attended a writing course, never mind a course in dramatic writing. My spelling was atrocious, and even if I had had a typewriter, which I didn't, I couldn't type. But I didn't let that deter me. I went back to my $8 a week rooming house directly across the street from the CBC studios on Jarvis Street, picked up pencil and paper, and commenced scribbling. Having arrived in Canada a child survivor of Hitler's Inferno only some 5 years earlier, I was bursting to tell what I had lived through, and here was my chance to tell it to the entire nation. My first effort, Sun in My Eyes, a biographical tale of the Holocaust, took me some 6 months of my spare time, but more than 5 years to have it go before the cameras. In time, I began to suspect that though there were no directives as to what was or wasn't acceptable to write about, one was expected to censor oneself. More than once, when rejected, I was reminded that my theme had nothing to do with Canada, yet my skills as a writer were never questioned. To test my suspicions, my next effort was a fluffy, romantic little story of boy meets girl on a Toronto streetcar, written over a weekend and immediately accepted. Taking a leaf from Paddy Chayefsky, whose obviously Jewish tales were presented as Italian, Marty, or Irish, the catered affair, and so on, my next submission about a mother partly modeled after my previous landlady, Mrs. Goldman, became Lost in a Crowd about a Polish-Canadian mother named Mrs. Jaworski. After its success, CBC Publicity referred to me as the most promising young writer, ironically at a time when I fantasized becoming a director. And so, while still holding my job in the graphic design department, I set out in my spare time to produce my calling card, an allegorical avant-garde short film called Run. As there was no film industry in Canada at the time, it made a big splash in the media and represented Canada that year at several international film festivals, including Venice. Following that, the opportunity presented itself not only for me, but for about a half a dozen other aspirants as well, to apply for directing positions. Each was given an allotted budget and the use of all CBC facilities to produce a dry run, which meant the resulting production would not air. It was simply a test. My competitors, wiser than I, had little difficulty in choosing their material, mostly from popular, established, familiar stage plays. I, on the other hand, having forgotten or perhaps ignored the previously hard-learned lesson, saw this as an opportunity to do something challenging and meaningful. And so, after combing through the public library, my own shelves, and mind, I landed on Elie Wiesel's book, Dawn, which spoke to me powerfully on a subject I could strongly identify with, the moral struggle of the new reborn post-Holocaust Jew resorting to violence against the British mandate in Palestine. Perhaps because I had never encountered personal anti-Semitism at CBC and thus felt free of any restraint, or in retrospect, I may have been overly naive not to take into consideration that CBC management had British accents, or at least were also of Anglo-Saxon descent, and I should have been cognizant of their sympathies. Nonetheless, my production, as it turned out, was the only one of the lot to have been recorded, a sign, I was told, that it was of sufficient quality to go to air after all. What disappointment awaited me when days later I was called into one of the bigwigs' offices to what he referred to as a post-mortem, a word I was not familiar with. In the end, all the others were offered contracts, while I returned to the graphics department where, in time, after serving as its head, I eventually, after 13 years, left the CBC for greener pastures, later establishing my own film company. Imagine then my total delight at being asked by the Toronto Jewish Film Festival, in honor of the late gifted and much admired John Kastner, who stars in Dawn, to introduce you now, close to 60 years later, for its very first showing ever. I invite you to evaluate, judge, and enjoy.